that he was no, I was going to say you were a child prodigy, but if I say that, then it makes you look older than you really are. After spending 4 years teaching at SUNY Stony Brook in New York, of course, he joined the faculty of the History Department at the Johns Hopkins University in 1973 and is the first tenured faculty member of color at that institution. In 1991, he was awarded the Leonard and Helen R. Stillman Endowed Chair in History, and he is currently also the director of the Center of Africana Studies. While at Johns Hopkins, Franklin Knight has held several short visiting positions at other universities, both in the United States and across the world, including here at Colgate. In fall of 2000, he was the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Distinguished Visiting Professor at Colgate, and happens to have taught some of the same courses I'm teaching right now in that semester. And indeed, his service to Colgate includes chairing the external team that reviewed the Africana and Latin American Studies program in 2006. In fact, the present curricular structure of the ALST program is a direct result of the work that Franklin and some others did while he was here in 2006. Now, one of the endearing characteristics of Franklin Knight is that he speaks his mind, frankly, and without malice. And I recall, after having learned that he had spent a semester at Colgate, when I was thinking of coming here in 2003, I contacted him by email to get some feedback. What's the institution about and so on. And like Franklin, he gave me the good, the bad, and the ugly of Colgate as he had experienced it. And then he went on to inform me as candidly as he could. He said, Hamilton and its environs are the nearest thing to Siberia. he doesn't like the snow and the cold. Franklin Knight has researched, written, and lectured extensively about the Caribbean and Latin America. His principal areas of interest are Spanish-American Creole society and the rise of American nationalism, slave societies and slave systems in the Americas, the Caribbean, and modern Latin America. His writing and public presentations include a few pieces, about 100 or so journal articles and book chapters, another 200 book reviews, and a couple hundred conference presentations, keynote addresses, and so on. So he has done his bit, I think, over the years. And he has done it not only in this country, but all over the world, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Europe, Japan, Australia, and so on. Among his many published books are Slave Society in Cuba during the 19th Century, which won the Black Academy of Arts and Letters Prize, The African Dimension of Latin American Societies, the Caribbean, the Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism, which is easily one of the best general histories of the Caribbean, and I have been using it for the last 10 years in my class. It's now in its third edition. And Slave Societies of the Caribbean, which is the third volume of a multi-volume series on the general history of the Caribbean published by UNESCO. Professor Knight has held research fellowships from the Social Science Research Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, the Ford Foundation, and the National Humanities Center. He served as president of both the Latin American Studies Association between 1998 and 2000, and the Historical Society between 2004 and 2006. He has other professional affiliations, of course, the Conference of Latin American History, the Association of Caribbean Historians, the Australian Association of Caribbean Studies, the American Historical Association, the Inter-American Dialogue, the Arthur M. Huntington Society, and others whose Spanish titles I will not butcher. In his capacity as a public historian, he has done numerous commentaries. Of course, I think we have some History 200 folk here who need to know, of course, that historians don't only teach and write in academic journals and write books and so on, but they do, some of them at any rate, do public work. He has done numerous commentaries and interviews that have aired on National Public Radio, the Voice of America, the BBC, the Macmillan Report, and C-SPAN, among others. For years, 40 years to be precise, he wrote a bi-weekly column for the Jamaica Observer, one of the leading newspapers, perhaps the leading newspaper in Jamaica. He also served as academic consultant and appeared on 7 television programs, namely Columbus and the Age of Discovery, The Buried Mirror, Americas, Plague, Invisible Armies, Crucible of Empire, the War of 1898, The Crucible of the Millennium, and the Louisiana Purchase. In fact, just today in class, I had him in one of my classes, and he was talking about the documentary, the Louisiana Purchase. As one might expect of a scholar of such high academic stature, he has held consultancies for multiple organizations, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Research Council, just to mention a few. And he has also served on academic advisory committees for Harvard, Princeton, the City University of New York, Swarthmore, Ohio University, the Schomburg Library, University of Florida, and University of Puerto Rico. For his outstanding contributions in various capacities to Caribbean and Latin American studies, and indeed to the history profession as a whole, Franklin Knight has received many prestigious awards. His first book, as I said before, got the Black Academy Prize, Arts and Letters Prize. He has been elected corresponding member of several literary academies and professional associations in Latin America, including Bahia, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. In 2007, he was the recipient of an honorary Doctor of Letters degree from the University of the West Indies. And in 2008, he became a lifetime National Associate of the National Research Council. And in fact, just last week, he received the highest honor from the premier literary and research institution in the Commonwealth Caribbean, the Institute of Jamaica, was awarded its prestigious Gold Musgrave Medal for Literature. With all of that, he told me yesterday that he's thinking of retiring. So we are very lucky indeed to bring him back to Colgate one more time before he rises into the sunset, though I suspect, unlike the British Empire, the sun will never set on Franklin Knight.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be back. I want to thank Professor Moore for that introduction, which reminded me or alerted me of two things. One is that it really is time to retire. Anyone who has done all those things ought not be in the business anymore. And the second, of course, is that I never thought that I would ever come back to Colgate. And not only do I come back to Colgate, but he has rustled up this very big crowd. So I want to tell you that I'm not the advance guard for Hillary Clinton. So if you expect a political message, you're going to be disappointed. He actually asked me to come and give the Bois, the annual Du Bois lecture, and it was a pleasure for me to do so, and to congratulate the African and Latin American Center, not only in being around for 30 years, no mean achievement in these times. I run one of those centers, and it is a Sisyphean struggle just to keep it going. If you are nicely endowed, as a few of our fellow institutions are, because they're very old and there was a time when there was money and Congress was out of the business of closing down the country. You could get some things and you could manage to continue, but today it is really very difficult. So I congratulate you on your 30th anniversary and hope that you will have at least 300 more anniversaries of this sort, each one better than the one before. Let me say that I have changed my title a little as promised. Professor Moore called me at a time when, at my age, you have to forgive me, every day seems to be Friday. And I say this because if I don't admit that it's Friday, they're going to accuse me of senility, advanced senility. So, you know, my Friday moments are a little more acceptable. I begin to think, oh, I'll be great over the weekend, and the Monday will be a little better than my Friday was. So at the time I thought, what should I talk about? And you know, obviously I have to talk about Du Bois. This is certainly his occasion. And I thought that because Du Bois and Marcus Garvey had so much in common for a very short time, that looking at these two characters who had a very heated sort of disputation, published disputation for some time, might be interesting. And then as I thought a little more about it, I thought I would add one character. And I think it's, but I leave it up to you, I think it's relevant, that is Antonio Maceo of Cuba, because I think for somehow if you look at the late 19th century and through the 20th century, we have three separate societies, the United States Society, the Cuban Society, and the Jamaican Society, all in interesting transitions. The United States, of course, is creating its nationalism around the Civil War and after, and then becoming an imperialist power, just about the time that we will discuss a little later, that W.E. Du Bois is coming to maturity and performing, and he lived a very long time. Antonio Maceo is a fundamental part of the Cuban struggle for independence, although he dies before it's over. But why Cuba is interesting in this, and I won't have time in this lecture, and I don't want to bore you, the introduction was so long I thought, is there time for a lecture? Why invite these people to punish them? So I will be nice, I will be brief, and I'll be gone before Hillary comes into town. Entourage. That will be a show. But Cuba, if you look across the Americas, and I would say even beyond the Americas, is a very interesting case. And there are two such interesting cases in the history of the Americas. One is Cuba, because normally in the evolution of state to nation, one usually constructs the state and then develops the nation. In the case of Cuba, we have a singular example of the nationality, the nationalism preceding the construction of the state. The other one, and it's relevant, but it's interesting, is the case of Brazil, which you know, those of you in Latin America. Because Brazil is the only colony that was the head of an empire. And that made fundamental changes, not only to the Brazil we know, but to the history of Brazil in the 19th century. So it's not that Brazil did not have the type of unstable period after its independence, is that the fact that Brazil, as head of the Portuguese Empire, was more important than Portugal, the metropolis, meant that Brazil had certain peculiarities that allowed it to play out in the 19th century in a way that only Chile experienced, that is, without severe internal civil war or political strife, sometimes for a very long period. So I thought I would bring these together and look at the life and times of Du Bois, Maceo, and Garvey, and to see how those times try to tell us something about something very important about the history of the Americas, and to hopefully make clear that in this sort of synthesis of these three biographies, we can look at the enduring problem of race, class, and color in the history of the Americas, and how they're really different in different societies, and yet we can't easily generalize about them. So let me briefly say, for those who are permitted to fall asleep in the next 2 minutes, what the lecture is all about. I do this all the time in my class, and I say, oh, you can fall asleep, you can leave. I don't care. Don't snore if you sleep, because I'm going to have to wake you and send you out. I don't like competition. you tell me that I'm running the class, let me make all the noise. If you're asleep, sleep quietly. Or you can go. I tell students who leave my class or drop my courses that it's a manifestation of intelligence that I expect from Hopkins students. So if you leave, I figure, yeah, you have a reason. So what it is that I'm trying to do is to take the three biographies in their times and say, how do these biographies reflect the societies that produce these individuals? And then why these three individuals ended up, in the case of Massey, of course, I could tell you he died prematurely, so he's a little out of the ball game at the end. But why they were both rejected by their domestic societies, even though we see that these were really different societies. The other thing that we can see about all three of these is the enormous mobility of the late 19th, early 20th century, which today is circumscribed, narrowly circumscribed. People just can't travel about the way they used to. Can't come to this country. There are all sorts of guys in Washington who are sons of immigrants themselves, who don't even believe we should have immigrants. In a hemisphere that's constructed by immigration, and where worldwide immigration is a fundamental part of the human condition. So we'll come back to that. The three characters are, of course, W.B. Du Bois, who was born on February 23rd, 1868, and died August 27th, 1963, the day before the Great March in Washington. And it was mentioned this year because it's the 50th anniversary and so on. Second was Antonio Maceo y Grajales, who was born on August 14th, 1845, and died prematurely in the southern part of Camagüey province on December 7th, 1896. And the third was Marcos Messiah Garvey. I'm not quite sure, the middle name was Messiah. Some call him Manasseh. His first ex-wife said it was Messiah, and she was the only reliable witness to the thing. What was good enough for her is good enough for me. I genuflect the women all the time with woman power. It comes from this. Plus, in this women with female audience that I have here, I am going to be very correct. I need to get back home. Du Bois, then, as you know, and I assume that you know a lot about these people, so that's why the synthesized biography is really to provide the context for the discussion that I want to have about time, place, and circumstances. Du Bois lived for 95 years. I don't want to live that long. No one should live that long. You know the old song which says, let's not get into that. Maceo lived for 51 years, and Garvey lived for 52 years. Both Du Bois and Garvey, as you know, died in bed. And of the three, as I mentioned earlier, Du Bois and Garvey were acquainted with each other and had an openly antagonistic disputation for a number of years. They were in Harlem, or better I should say New York. Garvey was in Harlem, but I think Du Bois was actually in Midtown Manhattan. And they could ventilate their opinions because both Garvey and Du Bois had important publications which are overlooked, although now that they're being digitized, they're becoming more accepted. But one of the lacunae of American historiography is the way that very important sources are overlooked simply because they're black press, black publications, or black authors. I mean, Du Bois is a classic case. He was one of the real outstanding intellectuals produced by the United States. And if you look in citation records, he doesn't appear until the civil rights struggle in 1965. He's more recognized outside the United States, in Europe, and among Caribbean and Australian intellectuals than he is here. And yet, reading his work today, it's absolutely striking how insightful that guy was in 1903, more than a century ago, about the condition. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the colored line. He could have said the problem of the future in the United States is the problem of the colored line. And he did try to put American history, and we're talking about 1903, actually earlier, in the wider context, not just of Plymouth Rock, which always bemused me when I go there because I think the more accurate description is Plymouth Pebble. It's very hard to find. The first time I went there, I just couldn't find it. And Jamestown. I don't know what Jamestown is all about, or the Alamo. I could jump over the Alamo. I'm not surprised that these guys couldn't survive a Mexican attack. So, then we kind of pop up these things as if they're really very important. But when you visit them, you're underwhelmed by the location and the occasion. So, what I'm trying to do here is actually to follow a little into Bois' thing, saying there is some value to be gained when we broaden the context in which we are trying to understand the history. Because the more you know about somebody else, the more you know about other societies, is the better you understand your own society. No man is an island unto himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. So let me do these synthetic biographical sketches in the order of their birth, the sort of chronology. And of course, the firstborn was Antonio Mateo Grajales. And for anyone interested, not just in the history of Cuba, but in the history of Latin America, this is a very well-known name, a very well-known character. And the date of his death, December 7th, which in the United States is always the attack on Pearl Harbor, ad nauseum, it's attack on Pearl Harbor. For Cubans, it's the day that Antonio Maceo died in a little town in southern Matanzas province called Punta Brava. You don't find it today. You drive along, and if people don't, it has a modest little monument there. There's a huge, impressive monument in Santiago, near his birthplace. But where he died in Punta Brava is just marked by a very simple, modest marker, actually, of that time. And if you're going to Cuba or you were in Cuba, it's between the little towns of Pedro Betancourt, it used to be a big mill, and Jovellanos, which used to be a little commercial center along that Royal Highway. Few warriors were more distinguished in Cuban struggle for their independence than Antonio Maceo, called by his fellow Cubans and others the Bronze Titan. He was born in San Luis, which is a very small town today. You can pass it even walking and not recognize it. It reminds me of some of these places out in the far west in the United States where you see the sign on the highway and it says some city or other and you expect at least a stoplight. And then you go another 4 miles and you say, where's the city? And you turn back and you come back. And of course it's like trading posts. And you read the sign again and it says that's on Salt City population 6. Things like that. Great markers they have here for these sorts of things. Maceo's father, Marcos Maceos, was one of those Spanish refugees who retreated after the loss of the Spanish army at Ayacucho. And of course, as you know, Cuba remained faithful. There was no appeal for independence there. It became designated the ever-faithful isle. It became the principal contributor and maintenance port for the Spanish treasury and actually the Spanish administration. By 1820, it was contributing over 25% of all public receipts in Spain. So it was very, very important and even became more important later on. So his father was what we would call a Spaniard, white Spaniard, who had done military service in Venezuela. His mother, Mariana Grajales y Puello, was an Afro-Cuban from Santiago, from a free family that had been free for a long time. Antonio was the oldest of 13 children, and what is remarkable about these, say compared with Garvey's 11, is that most of them grew to adulthood. And all of them, it was a very tight-knit family driven by a mother who should have been called Pilar, because I always associate Pilar as one of those venerable women that gives orders and the orders are immediately obeyed. So if you read any of Hemingway's books, you'll find that the character Pilar is always a woman who organizes things and gets things done promptly. So from a very early age, Maceo accepted responsibility and discipline. And he had no choice, actually, with a mother like that. She declared, he was a Freemason, free thinker. It's a well-to-do family. Eastern Cuba is the area of free, well-to-do families. I was in class today and talking about the southern part of the French colony of San Ramon. This would be a typical type of things. That is, the people are not very wealthy, but they are substantial middle class and quite vigorously independent. At the outbreak of the 10 Years' War, which began in September 1868 in both Cuba and Puerto Rico, Mariana Grajales sent all her family, all the kids, to war, including one that was only 7 years old. And she followed making these field hospitals for the troops wherever they went with her son. A lot of them perished in the 10 Years' War, and those who did not perish in the later war in 1895. She was that type of woman. So she traveled with her family and others all over, fighting the war all over central and eastern Cuba, until the war petered out 10 years later in 1878, in which there was a sort of stalemate accepted by both the Spanish and the Cuban insurgents. There was a little war after that, but Maciá did not accept it. And one of the conditions was that those who did not accept the peace of Zanjón, was not really a peace, could go abroad. And so he went abroad. He went to Guatemala, he was in Nicaragua, he was in the Dominican Republic, but spent most of his time in Jamaica. The mother died in Jamaica, Mariana Grajales died in Jamaica, but later she was, the remains were taken to Cuba, where again, if you go to Cuba, you can go to the Santa Ifigenia Cemetery in Santiago, where Jose Marti rests, and Bacardi family and Estrada Palma, the dignitaries are all there. In Cuba, there are no black families, there are no black cemeteries as they have here, and there are no military cemeteries as they have here. And the cemeteries are really quite interesting because you're only allowed now, unless you're a member of the revolutionary government or some distinguished, to be buried for 2 years in the ground in the cemetery in Cuba, after which you're given a box and bones are kept. But in Santa Ifigenia, you can actually see the history of Cuba, because so many of the distinguished Cubans were from then Oriente province, and of course that's the Sidney cemetery for them. The other is Colón Cemetery outside of, well, it's actually within the city of Havana. Maciá was articulate, astute, creative, determined, and competent. He participated between 1868 and his death in 1896 in more than 500 engagements and was wounded more than 25 times. He was one of the fighters who did not accept defeat, and his death, like that of Fidel Castro, was announced a number of times to the surprise of the people who were writing his obituaries. In 1895, he did become, there was a lot of dispute over why the war in 1868-78 was not successful. And in fact, the simple explanation was that Cubans were not convinced that independence benefited the vast majority of Cubans. And that's a whole different story that we could go into, and I suppose is taught in those here. But for the War of 1895, the big difference was the role that Jose Marti played, both among the exiled communities and in Cuba. He mobilized the Cubans and gave them one goal, that is, to create an independent state in which the Cuban nationalism could develop. Those of you in literature must have read a lot of Jose Marti about there is neither black nor white in Cuba, we're one Cuban, and so on and so forth. He was not smart enough to just be the intellectual of the new revolutionary country. He wanted to fight. Went on a horse, 3 weeks later he was shot, dead. Thus, Rios, just again in Oriente province, and the war was prosecuted by Máximo Gómez, who was from the Dominican Republic, Antonio Maciá, and others.
Most of the outstanding leaders, 1895 to 98, were black, or people we would call black, or mixed Cubans. And they were respected not only then but later, although the Americans tried to diffuse a lot of that nationalism that was mobilized around the War of Independence by, as you know, not only occupying Cuba for 4 years, but ruling Cuba until 1959. And that's another history we don't have to get into now. The point I want to make is really that Maceo had no formal education, but this did not mean that he was not a very intelligent and able person. Du Bois is different. He's an intellectual. He's certified in everything. But we tend to confuse, not just in the United States, but in most of the places where I go and have discussions with scholars, certification with education. So if you don't have a BA or an MA or a PhD, you're not educated. In fact, in some of the opportunities I had to make documentaries all over most of the Western world anyhow, I find that some of the most intelligent people I met are actually self-educated. No certificates of any sort, and they're much more lucid about the problems of their country, their society, of their world, than a lot of our so-called public intellectuals or people who pontificate in universities. So we shouldn't confuse the fact that he didn't have the education, and because this is a Du Bois lecture and Du Bois is highly educated and highly certified, that he's not in that same group. And you see it in the disputations, the letters that he wrote both with Gomez and with Marti. One of the questions I will leave as I pass on to look at Du Bois, who was the second born in this trilogy, is could the United States, because the United States had lots of wars, both domestic and international, could the United States at this time accept a figure like Antonio Maceo, a free, independent, non-white person in a leading position with a symbolic image, which, by the way, is very common across Latin America. I mean, Morelos of Mexico, sort of George Washington was black, he was called a negro. Bolivar was not, but he associated with a lot of black generals and had a lot of people of color in his armies. And there is a democratic openness to competence and character as the judge of individuals in these societies that seems not to be present here. So let's look at Du Bois. And again, if we look at Du Bois, we have to remember he is born in Great Barrington, not far from here. So some of you probably drive by Great Barrington and forget that actually somebody very important lived there, was born there, and loved the place. And Massachusetts was different then, I think, from now, because Du Bois writes with a lot of nostalgia about the idyllic nature of Great Barrington. Frankly, I've been there, and it's not a place I want to tell. But I am willing to concede that it might have looked better in 1868 or, I don't know, 1900 or 1920. You know, we don't look as good as we did in our younger days, none of us. So, why should we expect towns and cities to continue to look as well? Du Bois' mother, Mary Burkhardt Du Bois, came from a family that arrived in the Americas in the 1700s. And I'm interested in this fact because I'm almost sure that Burkhardt and Du Bois are, in fact, Haitian exiles. I can't find it, but they just seem to correspond with so many of Haitian refugee names that I run into in Jamaica, in Cuba, in New Orleans, in Charleston. And the end of the 18th century, I just have a feeling that they are, and that would explain why you have Du Bois and Burkhardt together. So, for the father, he disappeared very early. Can't find anything about him. He could have come from Jamaica. Sounds like a Jamaican man. Get a woman and you're gone. So, we don't know much about his father, but we do know that the mother, very much like Maceo's mother, was one of those who insisted on good education, and the young Du Bois had it. And actually, one of the things I will point out
as I go along that these three characters, Bois, Maceo, and Garvey, are all what we call their mother's sons. They are shaped, they don't have fathers who are very important in their lives, but their mothers are the driving force. They're emphasizing education and upward social mobility and something. They are the organizers. They keep themselves in place. The same is true, by the way, of Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, what it is about these characters that explain this consequence of the maternal thing. There are lots of pluses and there are lots of minuses. We don't know enough about Maceo because he died, I say prematurely. But, he didn't have that adult life in peacetime to express himself. But certainly one of the things we know about Du Bois and we know about Garvey is that despite this firm maternal upbringing, they were really never comfortable with women. And I won't say that Obama isn't, but I do know that one of the weaknesses of Obama is this yearning to be loved. You can't play hardboard politics because he wants everybody to like him. And I keep saying, when you're president, you don't want people to like you. You want them to do what you want them to do and to understand you. You eliminate them ruthlessly if they won't conform. You're president, that's why you're president. You're supposed to have cojones. Even if you're a woman. Think of Margaret Thatcher, otherwise known to history as Attila the Hen. Or the Iron Lady. Du Bois got his education, as you know very well, at Fisk University, at least his first degree in Tennessee, and his doctorate at Harvard, where he was the first black student to get the doctorate at Harvard. And just a little bit of a side, he applied for postgraduate studies at Johns Hopkins, and no other than the president of Johns Hopkins, Daniel Coit Gilman, in his perfectly beautiful handwriting, wrote him a rejection letter, which was polite but clearly racist. He didn't say, "I've discovered you're black," because he initially was excited. The first letter was, "Yes, we'd like to have you as a postdoc." And he obviously said, "Who's this guy?" Because Harvard resonates even then, back then, 1900. He's a black guy from Great Barrington. I'm afraid you wouldn't find it comfortable at Johns Hopkins at this time. We have no position for you. So he went to Berlin where he got a postdoctoral degree in studies on Germany. So again, as I repeat, in the formal sense, he was both educated and certified, became a distinguished historian, sociologist, economist, civil rights activist, and so on, which, when I look around in television at these so-called public historians, they don't even get their history right. They can talk, but they don't think. I go back to these people who really, genuinely had a broad and deep education. The Thomas Jefferson, the Benjamin Franklin. These are people who are profound thinkers. These superficial public intellectuals that we now have should give you back the money when they charge you for speaking to them. Please don't ask me for money. I'm not a public intellectual. I was forced into coming here. I like the type of coercion, though. It's like modern slavery, it's wage slavery. They pay you very well. $20 million a football player that says he's a slave. And keep saying, I wish I could play like him. I want to be enslaved at that rate. Du Bois published, as you know, he was a co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and for many, many years was its principal editor of the Crisis in New York. And it's a crisis that had him, or was his organ for this competition with Garvey in New York. Garvey is really very interesting because he was a good writer, a good speaker. He practiced it like Fidel before a mirror, and he was apparently very good at it. One of the things that surprised me about Garvey is how he could speak to audiences in English, in Spanish-speaking countries, and get the enthusiastic attention through a translation. I can talk in Portuguese in Brazil or in Spanish America, but when I go to Asia, I need an interpreter, and I can't tell what they're interpreting, but I do know that I fail to impress the audience unless we can speak in English or or Spanish at the time. Du Bois was also a member of the NAACP delegation to the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945, and organized and attended a number of Pan-African congresses. So there's an international dimension to him. It was, in fact, the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945 that he met the African Kwame Nkrumah, the first Prime Minister of an independent Ghana, who studied in the United States and got an invitation in 1961 to come to Ghana, where he spent the last years of his life, the last 2 years of his life. Those of you who go to Ghana will find in Accra the big compound that the government of Ghana and Nkrumah gave him. He is buried there, you can see, and I think that his wife is also buried there. And there is a research center there. It's a good place to stop if you're in Accra and look at, and there's a connection here. So I'll come back to those, but let me briefly give you my version at any rate of Marcus Garvey's story. Garvey was born in St. Anne Parish on the north central coast of Jamaica on August 17, 1887, as I said, the youngest of 11 children, only 2 of whom reached adulthood. His father, Marcus Messiah Garvey, just like the father, just like the son, they have the same name, they don't have the imagination to change the name, but anyhow, it's easier for the mother and wife to say, Moses! And then both names will come to you. I'm sure you quote Marcus at the time. His mother was Sarah Jane Richards, and both Garvey Sr. and his mother appeared to have had a good elementary education. One of the things that is very interesting about the British West Indies, and to a certain extent the United States, but I don't think I've seen as many studies of the United States, is that the elementary education after about the 1860s across the British Antilles is really compared with the British education in England, because it's the Second Reform Act that propagandizes or propagates this dispersal, which makes it almost a human right within these areas. Now, there are educational institutions, usually run by the church or benevolent foundations, before. But what happens after the 1860s, you begin to get public funds for public education. And so benevolent liberal governors would use these, in fact, to create this cadre of really educated people. I did a study some years ago of Jamaicans, and I ran into others, but my focus is on Jamaicans, who went to Cuba between 1919, that was the oldest I found, and 1931, because they were still alive, and I had to interview them. And one of the interesting things is how articulate and well-informed these people were at 15 or 16 when they emigrated from Jamaica, only with an elementary education. They did many subjects, and some of them, the better ones in the more private schools, had even had a smattering of Latin and Greek. I don't know if we do Latin anywhere as a standard thing in the Caribbean anymore, and Barbados still doesn't, but it's not common. When I was in my age, the year I went into my high school, they dropped Greek. Latin was still mandatory, but you had to do a modern foreign language rather than Greek. The other thing about Jamaica, for those of you who haven't been there, the central corridor of the island, Manchester, going over to St. Anne, is not prime sugar zone. So when you look in the history of Jamaica, you will find most of the outstanding people, in fact, were born in this area of Jamaica, Manchester. And it's not just because it's healthier, but it's because it's a long-standing free community that didn't have large plantations as the sugar zones did. The English would recruit these, and it's hilly and healthy. So the English would recruit these or encourage these in the religious areas. St. Anne was like that. The senior Garvey was a master mason, and he had 2 small landed properties, which he lost eventually. And a large private library, which was a little unusual even at that time. So young Garvey was a reader. The old Garvey preferred his books to his work, so they were always in trouble with debts and these sorts of things. And young Garvey had to curtail his education and go out to work in order to help his mother. And he was apprenticed to a godfather who was, in fact, a printer in Kingston, which is where he not only took this elementary education he got in St. Anne's Bay over, but begun to be associated with the type of political, the urban political folks who were at that time beginning to organize workers in Kingston. Actually, he worked for a short time for P.A. Benjamin, who was the first licensed chemist in Jamaica, and had a big manufacturing enterprise until he sold it in the 50s or early 60s to some international concern. But Garvey was ambitious, restless, articulate, extremely well-read for his time. It's a little hard to figure out where he got the things he would cite. You know, he is supposed to have gone after 1912 to Birkbeck College in London. Unfortunately, Birkbeck College was bombed during the Second World War. The records aren't there. So whether he attended as a student, we can't actually verify at this time. But he really was very, very well informed, and on his own initiative, continued to read throughout his life. By the time he was 27, which is about the time he's thinking of coming to the United States, he had been to London, he had been to Costa Rica and Panama and Nicaragua. He had published newspapers. His first big trip to Europe, 1912, when he went to England, and might have been when he either went to Birkbeck and took some law courses. He met Dusa Muhammad Ali. The name doesn't ring a bell, it should. He was one of the foremost publishers of a well-known monthly newspaper called Africa Times and Orient Review, which at that time was advocating the independence of Egypt. And a lot of West Indian would-be intellectuals who went at the beginning of the 20th century to England fell under his influence. Garvey claimed that it was while he was in London that he found Booker T. Washington's book, Up from Slavery, which would have a profound effect on his life. As he said, I read Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, and my doom, if I may call it that, of being a race leader dawned on me. I asked, where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? Where is his president, his country, and his ambassador, his army, his navy, his men of big affairs? I could not find them. And then I declared, I would help to make them. My brain was on fire. The black man would not continue to be kicked about by all the other races and nations of the world. I would create a new world of black men, not peons or serfs, dogs and slaves, but a nation of sturdy men making their impress upon civilization and causing a new light to dawn upon the human race. That was the basis on which he returned to Jamaica to begin the Universal Negro Improvement Association, established in Kingston in 1914 and transferred to New York in 1950. And the rest, as they say, is history. The timing was propitious. The relocation to the United States permitted the construction of the largest black political action group in the history of the world. And it was done by a self-educated man from St. Anne's Bay, Jamaica. So, when we begin to look at these three lives, and look at their countries and their times, we really have to look at the role that the experience of slavery did to the formation of political culture in the Americas. And clearly that's not a subject I have time to go into in great detail today. I would bore you to tears and you'd be justified in executing me before Hillary Clinton and I tomorrow. So I will spare you that justifiable homicide and short what I have to say about slavery. One of the observations, though, inescapable, is that slavery slavery was a fundamental part in the construction of all American political culture throughout the Americas, and one might even say in Western civilization. Because you begin to think, as I said to class earlier today, the origin of slave, the word slave, is from the people Slavs, who were the first commercially vended people down the Black Sea, around the Mediterranean. And when that source went out, then it became the Abyssinians, and those people, and the word was simply transliterated to other languages of slave. So the word slave is really the Slavic origin of a first sort of people of that sort. It is important, though, to realize that the condition of slavery varied across its experience wherever it was found, and varied within the Americas during the period here. And not just by organizational structure, British or French or Spanish or Portuguese, but even within small entities, a Jamaica or a Barbados or an Antigua, much less the United States. So that in the United States, Du Bois was born just after slavery is abolished. But Massachusetts did not have any slaves in 1776, and certainly did not have any slaves in the North during the period of the Civil War. I'll get into that in a little matter. So he's born in a society where slavery is almost as foreign to him as it is to Marcus Garvey, who was born in Jamaica 2 generations after the abolition of slavery. Maceo is the only one who is actually born in a slave society. Slavery is abolished in Cuba in 1886. But he doesn't experience slavery because the eastern part of Cuba is the part with very few slaves, even though the valley around Santiago does have a concentration of slaves. And so he knew about slavery and mobilized a lot of those slaves into the War of Independence. The reality of enslaving Africans in some part of the Americas created sort of 2 types of society. I have referred to them in my writings as the slave society, the society which was dependent on the institution of slavery, both as a labor device as well as an economic part, a fundamental, essential economic part of the social organization. And the value in the slave society of slaves is that they are valued commodities that create valued commodities. So in fact, you are compounding your asset by having slaves. In the other part, there are slaveholding societies. That is, the slaves there are supplemental to the labor force, usually about 10% or less of the working class. And that is very important because this is the big distinction you will find in the United States, where you actually have the spectrum from states with no slaves to states where the population are overwhelmingly slaves. So the majority of the population is overwhelmingly slaves. The United States of America, of the America of Du Bois, or the Cuba of Antonio Maceo, or the Jamaica of Marcus Garvey were at some time, in general, part of this American slave society that was different from slave societies before in history or other parts of the world in Africa, in the Mediterranean, or the Far East. And the institution of slavery would play a different role there, as I have mentioned before. And again, just an aside, although I would include Puerto Rico as a slave society, what is interesting in Puerto Rico is that it's a variant in the theme of the slave society. The reason I would say it's included in the slave society is because Puerto Rico had a sugar revolution from 1800 to 1850, in which they tried unsuccessfully to convert to a mini sort of Cuba. But if you look at slavery in Puerto Rico, at no time did it exceed more than 10% of the working population of Puerto Rico. And in contrast with Cuba or Jamaica or Colombia, or even Mexico in the 16th and early 17th century, is that there are times in Puerto Rico when they bought no more than 2 new African slaves per year. And this is going to contrast sharply with the others. And what it tells you is that, like the United States after 1790, they're producing their slaves domestically. And we have evidence for that. We see it in the birth records and so on. And also that in Puerto Rico, there are slaves that are being brought in illegally, but in small numbers simply because the demand is not there. for the slaves. So they're not replenishing. The demand is increased in slave societies because they are depleting their slaves and not reproducing to keep up to the demand need. So Puerto Rico has less than 10%. Cuba has over 70% of its workers enslaved up to 1847. It's less than that, but that's because they're bringing in Chinese to supplement the transition in the workforce. The United States imported no more than 5% of the transatlantic slave arrivals in the Americas between 1518 and 1870. And the United States slaves comprised only about 10% of the national state population in the United States at the time of the abolition of slavery in 1865. And apart from Nebraska, with some 15 slaves in 1860, and Kansas with 2, there are no slaves in New England, the middle Atlantic states, the middle states, the Midwestern states, the Middle West, and the far western states. Slaves in the United States comprise a variable minority in the border states, a substantial minority in the states designated Upper South, and only a majority of the population in the Lower South, although Texas is called Lower South, and Texas does not have a majority of the population of slaves at the time. At the time Du Bois came to adulthood, racial bigotry was prevalent, and race riots and lynching were commonplace across a vast area of the South, and in fact in some of the border states as well. Considerations of race and color were therefore a fundamental part of the struggle, personal and intellectual, that shaped the life and career of Du Bois, and it permeates his writing. You can see that preoccupation all the time. But he also came to maturity, to adulthood, at a time when the United States was transforming itself into an imperialist power, although aggressively denying that it was doing so all along. It was expanding with the succession of costly wars in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and of course the great wars in Europe and eventually in Asia. This further alienated Du Bois because he was also anti-war, although part of his anti-war stance comes from his proximity, although I don't think he ever declared himself a communist, to the communists in the Communist Party that was beginning in the United States. Du Bois, however, was not a pacifist. He writes he is in favor of just wars. A number of pacifists tend to make that distinction about just wars. But he did, in his writings, say that wars, as the wars that the United States was engaged in, including the First World War and the Second World War, was a self-serving machination by capitalists and imperialists, and he tended to conflate the two, and therefore make no distinction between them whatsoever. And after the Second World War, he was even further alienated from the government because, of course, the Cold War and the increasing political narrowness antagonized liberal thinking in the United States. And so they took away his passport for a time, and of course he was prosecuted, and there was really bad blood between the government and the people, and that's one of the reasons why he left the country when he could get a passport. And he was actually not allowed to come back. He wanted to come back for a time. We can say that Du Bois was neglected, discarded, and excluded, not only because he was black and Afro-American, but because he was an intellectual with liberal political beliefs, which was at odds with the political tendencies of the United States at the time. The Cold War actually did not allow for this sort of open thinking that actually had characterized and made the United States one of the models. So throughout Latin America, and even today, there is a great attempt to see the United States not as it is today, but as it was in 1776. And it really had good press from 1776 to about 1970. Maybe I'm going to say 1954, because the Vietnamese started really doing a bad press, and they spoke French. It's not an important language, but it's one of the 5 languages of the United States, so it's read by more people than would normally appreciate French culture. The United States was and remains today a country fixated on race and color. And the legacy of institutional racism is extremely difficult to overcome. And so one of the things that the Americans did, and I mentioned this earlier, is that anything that's written by a black person before, say, 1950 is really not recognized as important or being read, even if it applies to the society. And you can, you don't have to take my word for it, you can go look at Bernard Mirdel's American Dilemma, in which is based on the writings, and on the forward he's saying that he doesn't understand why American blacks are doing all this good research and it's not influencing American history or literature at all. Another peculiarity of the USA, unlike Cuba or Jamaica, was that there was a public conception that the country was divided exclusively between whites and blacks. And this dichotomy obscured the diverse reality and eliminated the conceptual space found in other countries in the Americas for people of mixed descent or of indigenous people to attain social acceptability and sometimes economic mobility. Indeed, prohibitions against mixed marriages were on the legal books of many states until the late 1960s. I think only in 1969 it was eliminated in Virginia. So, and this is long after the Civil Rights campaign. The Cuba of Antonio Maceo was one in which slavery and race were problematic, just as they were in the United States. But Cuba at no time institutionalized racism. There were no laws about where people could live. There were no laws about what people could do. There were no laws about how people should behave. There were conventions, of course. And Cubans wrestled with this diversity and ambiguity throughout their history. The non-European component of the Cuban population toward the latter part of the 19th century was about 40% of the population. And many originated from free immigrants of a much earlier period. Sometimes there's a tendency in the United States to think that all black people were descendants of freed people, when in fact, if you look at the early Spanish and Portuguese experience, the blacks who came were co-equal with the Portuguese or the Spanish and above the indigenous population, except for those indigenous populations who were of what the Spanish and Portuguese determined to be aristocrats or leaders. And in fact, in your Limpieza de Sangre requirement of the Spanish colonial period, the prohibitions were gypsies, Moors, Jews, and indigenous Americans. And that you could not then become upwardly mobile. Two factors made Cuba different from most other slave societies in the Americas. And you can justifiably say that every society is unique and has different characteristics. In the first place, however, Cuba had, as I have said, a large free population that was not a freed population. And that was important because its origins go back to the very beginnings of the Spanish occupation of the island of Cuba, or one might broaden it, of the Americas. The black people who came with the early conquistadores and explorers planted the Castilian flag and participated equally in the conquest and subordination of the land from Alaska, California, Buenos Aires, Cusco, Santiago, wherever the Castilian flag was raised across the Americas. And that, in the case of Cuba, began in 1511. Moreover, the Spanish colonial society was a diverse society in which color, class, status, and condition were woven into the social consciousness and reflected in both law and custom. In other words, you have baptismal records for non-whites. If you go to the churches, we're now using those records quite effectively. You have a registry for whites, registry for colors, registry for blacks. Or when there was a common registry, these indications were made. This is not to indicate that there was no discrimination. There was. And Maceo himself, not to mention the Dominican, who was much darker than Maceo, Maximo Gomez, would suffer from allegations that they wanted to build in Cuba a sort of Haiti, a black republic. I don't know if I told you that Maceo had an only son called Antonio Maceo, who went to high school in Syracuse. So there is a connection here. In fact, there is a scholar at Harvard, Maria Iglesias, who's investigating it. We don't know what happened to him afterwards, but there's a photograph, his high school graduation photograph in high school in Syracuse, and he looks exactly like his father as a young man. And it would be interesting to see what happened to him because his mother was Jamaican, and what we can deduce is that she must have been from a well-to-do Jamaican family because he not only went to a private preschool in Jamaica and private, but they could send him abroad to school in the United States. So we think she must have been, she was clearly black, but must have been a black person of substance. And I suspect that she was in the same sort of Cuban community or affiliated with it, the Temple Hall, Jamaica, which is a tobacco raising area, that a number of Cubans, and that famous picture of Jose Marti in Jamaica is actually taken in Temple Hall. So if the first trace was the nature of Cuban population towards the end of the 19th century, the second was the exceptional historical role of the city of Havana in the history of Cuba. Havana is important, more important than most American cities, was the largest and most important tropical city in the Americas, simply by virtue of its strategic geographical location and its extremely large and excellent and semi-enclosed harbor. So that already at the end of the 16th century, Havana is the most important city anywhere in the Americas. And as late as 1790, Havana is the third largest city in the Western Hemisphere, exceeded only by Mexico City and Lima. In fact, Havana in 1800, with a population of about 100,000, is almost twice the size of New York, which has about 60,000 in 1800. It is more than twice the size of the second largest U.S. city, Philadelphia, which has about 41,000 in 1800. Or Baltimore, the third largest city with 26,000 in 1800. Or Boston, which is considered to be very important, was very important, but actually did not have that large a population. It only has 24,937 in 1800. And these are the largest American cities. And again, as an aside, what is interesting is that by 1850, all these cities, including Baltimore, exceed Havana in population. There's a tremendous growth in the population of these American cities. Havana was not only a port, it was a fortified port. And the distinction is that apart from having the characteristics that would make it important as a port, the way that Veracruz was or Cartagena was, Havana is a port that collected the gold and silver of the Americas through transshipment to Spain. Therefore, at any given time, between 1585 and 1800, Havana had 10 to 20,000 troops billeted in the city. This gave the city a characteristic which made it more important than Cartagena or Veracruz or San Juan, or any Portobello or any of the other ports, San Juan, any of the fortified cities, because the city had to construct a type of services to maintain this large number of troops. So what you have are a lot of skilled artisans developing to work with gold and silver in Havana. They were allowed to make coins, they were allowed to make silver bars and gold bars and religious ornaments and these other types of things. But they also had to develop a provision market for the troops. In fact, I was astonished in January when I was talking to somebody in the center of Camagüey, that, and that's about 400 miles from Havana, that there until about 1850, Camagüey had to supply 1,000 head of cattle a week and cattle drive in Havana for the population in Havana. So what you get is economic opportunity in Havana that you don't find in Kingston, that you don't find in most other cities, simply because of this dual function of being a depository for treasures and the concomitant protective and supplying skills necessary for that. If you want to compare, you compare Florence and the Crusades. What makes Florence distinctive, rich, important is that Florence is a collecting point for the centuries of the Crusades. It's not the only one, but that makes Florence more important than Pisa or Siena or any of the other cities in Tuscany, because it had access to this. Ask them the beaches. They capitalized on that. So by the beginning of the 20th century, what we have are three areas which have characteristics which have roughly something in common but are quite distinctive. The Jamaican society is sharply divided along lines which Professors Moore and company have brilliantly discussed in their publications. It was an open and a diverse society, but it was a society, a colonial society, severely constrained in terms of economic mobility. And so even someone with Garvey's skills and competence and aspirations and ambitions found that he had to leave, to move, vote with his feet, to move. Upward economic mobility required that you travel, that you leave the island and you travel abroad. And what is interesting, of course, is that where Garvey has his greatest success is in the United States, which is expelling a character like Du Bois. It has no room for Du Bois. But Garvey comes here and forms the biggest organization. He gets wealth. He gets important, historical, international importance, and he becomes a big man until he runs afoul of the law. They trump up some charges which are, even today, really transparent, but very American. One is tax evasion, although there is no proof that he evaded taxes. The second is perjury, because the officials told him that he made so much money and he said he didn't. So they said he lied. Turns out that they couldn't prove that he made the money they said he made. And the third was using the mails for conspiracy and all sorts of other things without a single letter that he had written to anyone, either selling the Black Star Line or doing any sort of promotion of literature. But one of the funny characteristics of American jurisprudence is the way they like to manufacture these legal cases that collapse afterwards. Again, my last slide because I'm running out of time. Maryland, I like the state of Maryland because it's one of the most corrupt political states in the Union. But unlike most other corrupt political states,
We're just precisely looking at things from different